before the White Book recorded his deeds, or the white cloak ever touched his shoulders. There was a boy in Flea Bottom with no name worth keeping. No family, no seat, no sword that belonged to him by right, just the gutters of King's Landing, and a city that had no interest in whether he lived or died. The men who became legends in Westeros were mostly born to it. They trained in castle yards, jousted for the sons of great lords, and inherited their purpose along with their sigils. They knew what they were before they had to prove it. Sir Duncan had none of that. He had a dying old knight on a road, a man who may or may not have formally knighted him before the end, and a choice about whether to keep going anyway. He kept going. That choice would take him from the lowest street in the realm to the highest seat in the King's Guard. This is the story of Sir Duncan the Tall. Start with the smell. That is the honest beginning of this story. Not a throne room, tournament ground, or castle yard where boys of good family learned which end of a sword to hold. The honest beginning is a street in Flea Bottom, the lowest quarter of King's Landing. The smell of the harbour and the cookpots and too many people living too close together had all merged into something the people there had long since stopped noticing. The pot shop steamed through most of the day and into the night, their contents a subject best not examined too carefully. The alleys ran narrow and dark between buildings that leaned toward each other overhead, as though sharing a secret. Children ran them at speed, not because they were in a hurry to get somewhere, but because standing still in Flea Bottom was how you lost whatever you were carrying. The city had larger ambitions for itself. The Red Keep sat on its hill, the great sept cast its shadow. The lords and merchants of the upper quarters moved through a world of stone floors and oil lamps and food that was reliably what it claimed to be. Down in Flea Bottom, none of that reached. The city's ambitions stopped at the bottom of the hill and let the rest sort itself out. Into this, a boy, large, even as a child, larger than the boys around him by a measure that people noticed and occasionally found threatening. No family name, none that he knew, none that anyone who knew him could supply. His earliest memories were alleys and hunger, and the quick calculation of whether the figure coming around the corner was a problem or an opportunity. The kind of childhood that does not produce poets or courtiers, the kind that produces survivors, if it produces anything at all. He would be remembered as Dunk, later Sir Duncan, later still, Sir Duncan the Tall. Lord Commander, White Sword, 4 pages in the Book of Brothers. That was the name that Jaime Lannister would read 3 centuries on, and simply confirm was the name of a great man. But none of that was visible from Flea Bottom. From Flea Bottom, he was just a large, quiet boy who was going to have to figure something out before the city figured him out first. Living in Flea Bottom made a specific kind of person, not the kind shaped by castle yards and training masters and the careful inheritance of martial tradition from father to son, the kind shaped by the understanding that the world had no particular intention of helping you, that waiting for rescue was how you starved, that the only things worth trusting were the things you could verify with your own hands. The knights Dunk would later ride beside had learned their oaths as a kind of poetry, words spoken at a ceremony received from a father or a lord, worn afterward like a sigil, something that identified you, that told the world what house you came from and what your family stood for. For them, the vow and the man who spoke it were layered things, each reinforcing the other. The oath gained meaning from the bloodline, and the bloodline gained honor from the oath. Dunk had no bloodline to borrow from. when he eventually came to understand what a knight's vows actually meant. Not the ceremony, but the practice, the daily decision of whether to act on them when acting was expensive. He understood them not as poetry, but as structure, the thing that held you together when everything outside you was coming apart. He kept his oaths because without them, he was only a large man with a sword, which was not nothing, but was considerably less than what a knight was supposed to be. That understanding did not come from Flea Bottom. It came from the man who found him there. Sir Arlan of Pennytree was not a name the realm knew well. A hedge knight, which is to say, a knight without lands or keep, a sword available for hire, a man who moved from tournament to tournament and lord to lord. He managed to live on the narrow margin between his skills and the world's indifference to them. He was not young when he found Dunk, and his best years in the lists were behind him. In an earlier life, he had broken lances against Prince Baelor Targaryen himself. He had gone 4 passes against the finest knight in the realm and been unhorsed. That was not a disgrace, but rather the kind of result that got quietly spoken of with respect in the right company. He had also fought at the Redgrass Field, where the first Blackfyre rebellion ended in blood and fire, and the exhausted silence that follows a battle where 10,000 men have died. He had fought on the right side. His nephew Roger, his sister's son, and his squire had not survived it. Roger was lost in the fighting, and Arlan had carried that loss ever since. What brought Arlan to King's Landing after the war is not recorded. At some point, he came through the city, found Dunk in Flea Bottom, and made a decision. That decision would, through a sequence of events no one could have charted at the time, reshape the future of the realm. For roughly 12 years, they travelled together. Tournaments and small campaigns, and the endless in-between work of a hedge knight's life. Escorting merchants through dangerous roads, hiring out to minor lords for disputes too small to trouble a great house, sleeping under sky when the coin ran short, and under a lord's roof when it didn't. Arlan was not a demanding teacher in any formal sense. He was not the kind of man who set schedules and drilled his squire in the precise footwork of court-taught swordsmanship. What he had was something harder to teach deliberately, a way of being in the world. He did not lie to the lords who paid him. He did not take what wasn't offered. When he made a promise, he kept it, even when keeping it cost more than the promise had seemed to be worth at the making. He had seen, on the Redgrass Field, what happened when men abandoned their oaths because the cause seemed lost. He had no intention of becoming that. Dunk watched this, day after day, for 12 years, and it went in. Not swordsmanship, though Arlan taught him that too, imperfectly, with the patience of a man who knew he was passing on enough. Not jousting, though Dunk learned the lance well enough to enter a tournament without embarrassing himself. What went in was something quieter and more durable. The understanding that the vows meant what they said, that a knight who only kept his oaths when they were convenient had not really kept them at all. And then Arlan died. On the road to a tournament at Ashford meadow, somewhere in the Reach, the old man's health gave out entirely. His squire buried him on a hillside facing west, because Arlan had always liked sunsets. And here the record must pause, because what happened next is not as clean as it might appear. Dunk took Arlan's horses. He took the armour. He continued to Ashford. When he presented himself for entry in the tournament, he named himself Sir Duncan and said that Arlan had knighted him before he died, that Arlan had called for his longsword, bade him kneel, and given him the words. Perhaps that is exactly what happened. The illness had come quickly. A man who meant to knight his squire properly might have found himself doing it at the last moment, on a roadside, with no witness and no ceremony beyond what the moment allowed. But the record leaves another possibility open, one that Dunk himself, in certain moments, appears to have felt the weight of. Later, at Ashford, when the chance came for him to knight another man, as any knight can do, the tradition is clear. He refused. He said he should not. The words he chose were telling. That word sits in the record like a stone in a stream. Small, easily stepped over, impossible to pretend isn't there. Arlan had already lost one squire. Roger had gone to the red grass field and not come back, and the grief of that had ridden with the old man for years. Perhaps he could not bring himself to knight Dunk and watch the boy ride off to his own life. Perhaps the illness moved faster than the intention. Perhaps the dying are not always able to complete what they meant to do. Whatever the truth, Dunk lived with the question rather than answering it. He carried it the way a man carries a healed injury, present but workable, folded into the way he moved through everything that came after. What is certain is this: Arlan gave him the oaths, not as words spoken over a kneeling boy, but as a 12-year demonstration of what the words were supposed to mean in practice. The example of a man who kept his promises in lean times and in good ones, on lost causes and winning ones, with witnesses and without them. Whether or not the ceremony happened, the knighthood Dunk carried into Ashford Meadow was built from that. The one that would eventually fill 4 pages of the White Book and outlast the dynasty it served. The ceremony, had it happened, would have been the least of what he inherited. To understand what Dunk rode into at Ashford, you need to understand what Westeros was in the year 209 after Aegon's conquest. On the surface, it was a realm at peace. King Daeron II sat the Iron Throne. He was the 12th Targaryen to do so, a man of genuine ability who had done something none of his recent predecessors managed. He had ended the long war with Dorne, not through conquest, which had been tried and had cost the realm a king and an army, but through marriage and patience and the slow work of diplomacy. The Martells were inside the realm now, rather than gnawing at its edges. The great houses were not openly at war. The harvest had been acceptable. By most of the measures that matter to the people who keep records, the realm was stable. Daeron was not a warrior king in the old mould. He was a reader, a thinker, a man more comfortable with parchment than a lance. Some lords respected him for it. Others thought it a weakness that time would eventually expose. He had competent sons, a functioning court, and a hand who held the administrative machinery of the kingdom together with something close to surgical precision. The wound the realm was carrying in 209 years after Aegon's conquest had a name: Daemon Blackfyre. And though Daemon himself had been dead for 13 years, the wound had not closed the way wounds are supposed to close. The story began, as so many of Westeros's troubles begin, with a king who made decisions he should not have made. Aegon IV, called the Unworthy, a name his own court gave him and posterity kept, had spent his reign accumulating a remarkable record of poor choices. Among the last of them, on his deathbed, was this: he legitimized all of his bastard children, every one of them. They were called the Great Bastards, and there were enough of them to fill a small court of their own. The most gifted was Daemon Waters, who became Daemon Blackfyre. The sword itself was kingship made physical. Passed down from ruler to ruler, it was the mark of the line's authority. Giving it to a bastard was not a gesture any careful man could interpret as neutral. Daemon was everything a king was supposed to look like, and many things a king was supposed to be. He was tall and broad and silver-haired in the old Valyrian fashion. He fought like something out of legend, strong enough and skilled enough that men who watched him in the lists stopped what they were doing and simply stared. He was generous. He was approachable. He had the quality that the great lords could recognize and could not quite name. The quality that made men want to follow without being entirely sure why. His half-brother Daeron II, the true-born heir, was none of those things. Clever, yes. Capable, certainly. The contrast was visible, and the realm felt it. There were lords who looked at the two men and formed their own conclusions about which one the gods had intended for the throne. The rebellion came in 196 years after Aegon's conquest. Daemon raised his standard. The three-headed dragon reversed, black on red. The answer came at the red grass field. 10,000 men died. Daemon died. The rebellion collapsed into rout. But Bittersteel did not die. Aegor Rivers, another great bastard and Daemon's most capable general, got away. He crossed to Essos with Daemon's surviving sons and took the sword with him. In the free cities, far enough from the reach of the Iron Throne to breathe, he began the long work of keeping the Black Dragon's cause alive. That work was still ongoing when Dunk rode toward Ashford. This is the shape of the world he had entered. A realm that looked settled from any reasonable distance, but was carrying, just beneath the skin, a division that had not been fully resolved. The lords who had backed the Black Dragon had bent the knee after the Red Grass Field, surrendered their fortresses, paid their fines, watched their children taken to King's Landing as hostages against future rebellion. They had accepted the peace because there was no choice. That was not the same as believing in it. The tournament circuit was, among other things, a pressure valve. Men trained for war needed somewhere to put that training. A tournament was a place where the violence had rules, and the wounds were usually survivable, and no one's keep got burned at the end of it. The great lords sent their sons. The hedge knights arrived from every direction, following the prize money and the reputation that could be made in the lists. For a few days around a castle yard, the tensions that ran through the realm had somewhere to go that wasn't war. Dunk was part of this world now, in its lowest tier. A hedge knight with no permanent employer, no lands, no great house at his back. He had a name he had given himself, a suit of armor he had just bought second-hand, a shield that a puppeteer would shortly be asked to paint. He had a knighting that may or may not have happened the way he said it did. He was entirely his own invention, which meant he was also entirely his own responsibility. Ashford was more complicated than a tournament. Daeron II's family would be there in numbers. The king had 4 sons: Baelor, Aerys, Rhaegal, and Maekar. Between them, they had produced enough sons and grandsons to fill out the stands and the lists alike. Baelor was the crown prince. He was the best of them, by reputation and by the evidence of people who had dealt with him closely. A soldier who had actually fought. A statesman who had actually thought. A man whose eventual kingship the realm was quietly looking forward to. Aerys was bookish and uninterested in the physical tests the tournament demanded. Rhaegal was eccentric in ways the court found charming and occasionally alarming. Maekar was the youngest of the 4 and in many ways the hardest. A compact, angular man who who had proven himself on the battlefield and lived with a complicated awareness of how far short of Baelor everyone else in his family fell, including himself. Maekar had sons at Ashford too. Daeron, his eldest, was a young man with the Targaryen gift for prophetic dreams, which had proved considerably more burden than blessing. He was managing it as best he could, with quantities of wine. Aerion was Maekar's second son. Brilliant was the word people used, though what they meant was that he was perceptive in the way certain dangerous animals are perceptive. Always reading the room, always calculating where the edge was and whether he could reach it before anyone could stop him. And then there was Egg, the fourth and youngest. His head had been shaved by his elder brother Daeron before he disappeared into an inn near Ashford to avoid his responsibilities. The shaved head was practical. Targaryen's silver hair was recognizable. He looked instead like a stable boy, or something close enough that a tired hedge knight at an inn could make the mistake without embarrassing himself. That hedge knight was Dunk. The mistake was mutual and brief. The boy was too sharp to pass as a stable boy for long, and Dunk was not, despite his old master's occasional commentary on the subject, entirely without the ability to notice things. A crowded family in a stable realm, most of them about to collide with a large man from Flea Bottom, who had no particular understanding of what he was riding into, and no intention of adjusting his behavior based on who he found there. That combination was about to become very expensive for everyone involved. The tournament at Ashford Meadow was supposed to be a celebration. Lord Ashford's daughter had reached her 13th name day, and her father had opened his gates and his fields to mark it in the fashion great lords used to mark such things, with pavilions and pennants and the controlled violence of the joust, which gave men something to watch and gave knights something to prove. It gave the small folk of the surrounding villages a reason to set up stalls and sell things, and feel, for a few days at least, that the world was putting on a show for them. The meadow outside the castle filled with colour. The great houses sent their sons. The tournament circuit brought its usual trailing population of merchants and entertainers and hedge knights looking for prize money and a moment of reputation. The surface of things was arranged to look fine, everyone performing their appropriate role, the machinery of chivalry running as it was supposed to run. Dunk arrived without credentials. He sold one of Arlan's horses to buy himself armour from a smith named Steely Pate. Practical, serviceable armour, not the polished plate of a man with a great house behind him, but solid enough to enter a list without embarrassing himself. He went to register. The steward looked at him the way stewards look at men, who appear from nowhere claiming to be something, with the skepticism of a man whose job it is to maintain standards, and who does not intend to be the one blamed when they slip. He needed a knight to vouch for him, which of course he did not have. What he had by what felt like accident, and was perhaps something else, was the attention of the Crown Prince of Westeros. Baelor Breakspear, they called him, looked at the large, uncertain young man standing at the registration table and said something on his behalf, not because he knew Dunk, not because Dunk had done anything yet to deserve it. Baelor was the kind of man who looked carefully at things. When he looked carefully at Dunk, he found something the steward had not thought to search for. Dunk was entered in the tournament as Sir Duncan the Tall. This small act of attention would, in ways neither of them could have anticipated, cost Baelor Breakspear his life. The bald boy from the inn had followed him to the tournament grounds on the back of a lamb cart and had introduced himself simply as Egg. He had the manner of someone accustomed to being sharper than the people around him, and he made himself impossible to refuse. He was 9 years old. He was impudent in the precise way that only genuinely clever children can be impudent, accurately. When he told Dunk he looked as though he needed a squire more than most, he was not wrong, and they both knew it. Dunk accepted him for the duration of the tournament. He did not yet know who Egg was. By the time he found out, it would be too late to change the decision, and he would not have changed it anyway. That night, under an elm tree at the edge of their camp, a falling star crossed the sky. Egg pointed it out and said it was lucky. Dunk was not certain he agreed. They slept on the ground, the way hedge knights sleep, and in the morning the tournament began. Then, a few days later, Aerion Brightflame crossed paths with a puppeteer named Tansel. A version of this event could be told quickly. A prince was cruel to a commoner. A knight intervened. The law came down on the knight. That version is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses the weight of what Aerion actually was. Without that weight, the choice Dunk made looks simpler than it deserves to. Aerion Targaryen had never been made to stop. This was not a momentary lapse in an otherwise composed life. It was the shape of his character, formed over years in a world that had consistently arranged itself around his preferences. The servants who were too afraid to refuse him. The lords who were too careful of their position to object. Tansel was a puppeteer, a Dornish woman performing at the tournament fair. Her show a story in which a dragon was slain. Aerion watched it. He decided that depicting the death of a dragon constituted an insult to his house. What followed was deliberate and methodical. He broke her fingers one by one with the specific intention of ensuring she could never work her puppets again. This was not anger. Anger is impulsive. This was punishment, administered carefully by a man who felt entirely entitled to administer it. Knights stood nearby, a tournament ground full of them, men who had sworn the same oaths Dunk had sworn, to protect the innocent and defend the weak. They watched, they calculated, they weighed the cost of intervening against a prince of the blood, against the cost of doing nothing. They chose doing nothing, because doing nothing was survivable, and the alternative was not obviously so. Dunk did not make that calculation, or rather, he made it and reached a different answer, because the variables were not the same for him as they were for everyone else. Those other knights had lands and positions and the family names that would survive whatever they chose to do here. What Dunk had was the oaths. That was the whole of his claim to be what he said he was. A knight who kept his vows only when they were convenient had not, in any meaningful sense, kept them at all. If he walked past this, he walked past the only thing that distinguished him from a large man with a sword. He struck Aerion in the face. He did it fast and without ceremony, a blow that loosened a tooth. The consequences descended on him immediately, and with the full weight of a system that had been built, in part, to protect princes from exactly this kind of contact. He was arrested. The charge, as the law saw it, was assault on royal blood. This was an offence that traditionally resolved with the loss of the offending hand, or worse. Aerion, who knew the law as well as anyone, and whose instinct for using systems against people was finely developed, turned it toward the maximum possible damage. He demanded a trial. Not a simple one. A trial of 7. A form of combat so rare it had not been invoked in over a century, rooted in the theology of the faith. It was built on the premise that if 7 champions fought on each side, the gods would see justice done. 2 teams of 7 fighting until one side yielded or could no longer stand. Aryan assumed Dunk could not find 6 men willing to stand with him against a prince's champions. He was almost right. Before the trial was arranged, on the night things were still uncertain, Dunk had an encounter that lodged itself in him and did not fully let go. Daeron Targaryen, Maekar's eldest son, the young man who had been drinking himself through the tournament rather than competing in it, found him and told him about a dream, not a casual telling. Daeron dreamed in the way that the old Targaryen blood occasionally produced, vivid, pressing. In the dream, a dragon had fallen on Duncan. Enormous, Daeron said. Wings wide enough to cover all of Ashford meadow. It fell dead upon him, and the smoke cleared, and Duncan walked away. Daeron told it the way a man tells a thing he wishes he did not know. He could not say what it meant. He only knew that his dreams had a history of being accurate, and that this one weighed on him. He had felt, for whatever reason, that Dunk should hear it. Dunk had no way to interpret what he was being told. He filed it alongside everything else that was happening and did not think about it further. There was no time. He had a trial to survive. The assembly of his 7 was its own small portrait of how loyalty actually works. Some came from conviction. Sir Lionel Baratheon, large and loud and genuinely offended by what Aryan had done, had a sense of honour that did not require much calculation before engaging. Sir Humphrey Harding, still recovering from a broken leg, came anyway. Sir Humphrey Beesbury came. Sir Robin Riesling came. Egg recruited most of them, working quietly and urgently through the tournament crowd, calling in whatever debts of obligation and shared principle could be found. One man, Stefan Fossaway, promised his sword and then sold it. Aryan offered him a lordship, and a lordship was more than principle could comfortably outweigh. He crossed to the other side. His cousin Raymond, disgusted by the defection, stepped forward to take his place. Dunk had Raymond knighted on the spot, refusing to do it himself, saying he should not, letting another knight perform the ceremony, and the 7 were assembled. Then Baelor Breakspear arrived. He had not been asked. He came because he had been watching what was happening and had reached his own conclusions. He was the Crown Prince of Westeros, the Hand of the King, the most respected man in the realm below his father. He put on his son's armour and announced that he would be Dunk's 7th champion. The Kingsguard on Aryan's side, he noted, were sworn not to deliberately harm their own prince. This gave his side an advantage he intended to use. Nobody in the field that day misunderstood what it meant for Baelor to be standing where he was standing. A prince of the blood, fighting for a hedge knight, because the hedge knight was right, because that was what it meant to be what both of them had sworn to be, a true knight of the 7 kingdoms. The 7 fought. What happened on that field was not clean or heroic in the way songs prefer. Men went down early. Sir Humphrey Beesbury was killed in the first charge. Sir Humphrey Harding, still carrying his broken leg into the fight, would die of his wounds in the days that followed. The field churned under boots and hooves and became the kind of ground that turns a formal combat into something older and less governed by rules. Dunk found Aryan. The formal advantage had long since dissolved into scrambling. Aryan was trained, skilled, from a lineage of fighters. Dunk was none of those things. What he had instead was size, endurance, and 12 years of fighting in the particular style that Flea Bottom instilled in people who needed to survive. Not elegant, not technical, but relentless. Willing to absorb damage in order to close the distance. willing to go to the ground rather than disengage. In the space that Aryan needed to use his training, Dunk was already inside it. The prince yielded. The trial was over. Dunk was found innocent. Aryan withdrew his accusation. Then someone thought to remove Baela's helmet. He had taken a blow to the back of the head. The helmet had hidden it. When it came off, they saw that the skull behind it had been caved in by something heavy, something with force behind it. A mace, almost certainly, from the chaos of the fighting. The blow had most likely come from Maekar, not intentionally. In the confusion of the melee, fighting on what he understood as the opposite side, Maekar had not known where his brother was. The blow was the kind that happens in battles where everyone is moving, and the lines have collapsed and men are swinging at shapes. Baela Breakspear, future king, died in Dunk's arms. The crown prince of Westeros, the realm's best hope for the generation to come. A man who had proven that afternoon, on a muddy field in the Reach, that he understood what the oaths he had sworn actually meant and was willing to pay the price they asked. He died because a puppet show went wrong. He died because a prince had never been taught to stop, and a hedge knight had not been willing to look the other way. The victory was real. Dunk had won. The right side had prevailed. 2 good men were dead. A third would follow within days. The Crown Prince of Westeros was gone before his time. This is the first thing the story teaches, and it teaches it without apology. Doing the right thing does not protect you from what doing the right thing costs. The vow and the price of the vow are not separate items. Maekar came to Dunk afterward, in the particular silence of a man who has done something he did not intend and cannot undo. He knew what people would say. That rumor would follow him the rest of his life. That he had killed his brother, whether by accident or design, and that the accusation would never fully settle. He could not answer it. He could only live with it. What he did, instead of letting the thing end there, was look at his youngest son, at Egg, at the boy who had spent the tournament recruiting champions for a hedge knight and who had shown, in that week, a quality that the rest of Maekar's sons had not. Dunk had argued that Egg should stay on the road rather than return to Summerhall, that the boy needed to see the world from the ground rather than from a palace window if he was ever going to understand what he was eventually expected to govern. Maekar agreed. He gave Egg to Dunk, and he sent them both away. The hinge of the whole story turns on that moment. Not the trial, not the death. The quiet afterward, when a hard and grieving man looked at a hedge knight who had cost him everything and decided to trust him anyway. They left Ashford with a horse each and no particular destination. That was the honest shape of their situation. Dunk had a squire he had not intended to keep, a shield with fresh paint on it, a dagger scar on his cheek, and no sworn lord to report to. Egg had a shaved head, a signet ring hidden in his boot that he was not supposed to be carrying, and a father who had just given him away to a hedge knight. Neither of them had anywhere they urgently needed to be. So they went south, into Dawn. Tansel had gone that way. She was the puppeteer whose fingers Aryan had broken, who had fled the tournament grounds after the trial and left no word of where she was heading. Dunk wanted to find her. He did not say this directly, the way he rarely said direct things about the things that mattered to him most, but the route they took made it obvious enough. They travelled the Prince's Pass and the Red Desert roads, asking at inns and market towns, and they did not find her. Dawn is a large country, and it does not give up what it is keeping. Eventually, the trail went cold entirely, and they turned north. Most of what followed, for the better part of 2 years between Ashford and the Reach, was the road, the work, the lean arithmetic of a hedge knight's life. Tournaments when there were tournaments to find. Service to minor lords when service was available. Escorts for merchants along roads just dangerous enough to make an armed man worth hiring. The song skipped this part, joining great deeds with a clean line of purpose that implied the knight always knew where he was going and why. The reality was more interrupted. Coin running short, stewards at castle gates deciding a road-worn man and a bald boy were not worth the trouble. Mornings when breakfast was a luxury. Nothing to be done about any of it except ride on to the next gate. Dunk had grown up in Flea Bottom, which meant none of this was unfamiliar in any way that surprised him. What it was instructive. He was seeing the realm from a level that most knights never occupied for long. The lords whose service he took briefly were themselves far enough down the ladder that the great houses had stopped paying them much attention. Their small folk were further down still, living inside the consequences of decisions made entirely without them. A dry year could break a family that had nowhere to draw against. A lord's quarrel with a neighbour, trivial from the tower, could ruin the farms that sat between them. Dunk watched. He filed it. He was not a man who made speeches about what he observed, but the observations went in and stayed. Egg observed the same things, from a different starting point, and with a different quality of shock. Mekar's household at Summerhall had not been soft. Mekar was not a soft man, and he had not raised his sons to expect softness. But Summerhall was still a palace. The order of things there was understood. Who stood where, who served whom. What name opened doors, and what name closed them. Egg had grown up inside that order, as its smallest and least regarded member. This had made him sharper than his brothers in certain ways, but had not required him to be invisible. On the road with Dunk, he was invisible, a shaved head boy of no apparent consequence, who carried water and tended horses and was told at inns that the rooms were full when anyone could see they were not. He and his knight did not look like the kind of guests an innkeeper preferred. The world, encountering him without his name, had no particular interest in making itself comfortable for him. This was new, and it went in the same way the road went in for Dunk, not as philosophy, but as experience, the kind that sits in the body rather than the mind, and shapes the instincts rather than the arguments. The friendship between them settled during this period into something that required less tending as it grew. It had not formed with any announcement. There had been no moment where they decided to trust each other. It had accumulated the way most durable things accumulate, through shared hardship repeated often enough that the sharing became a habit, and the habit became something that would be difficult to break, even if either of them had wanted to. Dunk was not, in any formal sense, Egg's teacher. Egg knew things Dunk had no access to. History and letters and the names and alliances of the great houses, the administrative machinery of the realm, the language of courts and councils. When Dunk needed to understand a parchment, Egg read it. When he needed to know why a lord might behave in a particular way, Egg explained it, usually in fewer words than Dunk expected, and with a directness that occasionally startled him. What Dunk was something Egg had not had before. A model. A man who behaved the same way whether anyone important was watching or not, who spoke to a small folk innkeeper with the same directness he used with a lord, who had, at Ashford, struck a prince in the face because a woman was being hurt, and that was what the oath said to do. Not because it was safe, not because he had weighed the odds, but because not doing it would have made the oaths into decoration. Egg had grown up surrounded by people performing. His family performed for each other and for the court. Aerion performed cruelty with an audience in mind. Daeron performed drunkenness, partly to disappear from an audience he could not otherwise escape. Maekar performed hardness because the alternative felt like exposure. Dunk did not perform. For a boy who had spent his whole life reading rooms and managing impressions, this was stranger than any foreign country they travelled through. Not a different kind of performance, but the absence of it entirely. The thing underneath, when there was nothing on top. They visited Egg's brother Aemon at the citadel in Old Town. He was already a young maester, quiet and precise, with the kind of mind that took everything in and revealed very little. The meeting was brief and careful, as these things often are between siblings long separated by circumstance. Dunk stood at the edge of it, aware he was witnessing something he did not fully understand, and had the sense to remain silent. Then they turned their faces toward the reach, toward a drought and a dammed stream, and the kind of trouble that begins with a very small thing and has a history underneath it long enough to drown in. Standfast was not much to look at, a single tower of old stone on a rise above the reach, stubby and weathered, with a yard that held chickens and a well, and not a great deal else. The sort of fortification that had been built in a harder age. It had been maintained since then out of habit and pride rather than any military necessity. It did not dominate the landscape. It barely interrupted it. 3 small villages nearby owed their service to it, and those villages and the land between them constituted in total the holdings of Sir Eustace Osgrey. He was quick to mention House Osgrey, because the house had a history considerably more impressive than its current circumstances. He was old, white-haired, straight-backed, with the particular dignity of a man who had decided long ago that dignity was the one thing he could still afford, and had maintained it carefully. He spoke of the past, the way men speak of countries they have been expelled from, with longing, with precision, with the specific grief of someone who remembers every detail of a life that no longer exists. Osgrey had once been a name that meant something in this part of the Reach. The lands had shrunk. The great branches of the family had withered. What remained was Standfast and the old man inside it, and the pride that had outlasted everything else. He needed swords. Duncan Egg took service with him, which was the straightforward part of the arrangement. The complication arrived almost immediately in the form of a dammed stream. The stream ran between Standfast lands and those of Coldmoat, the neighbouring holding. It had been dammed by Lady Rohan Webber's people, cutting off the water that Eustace's 3 villages depended on through. Dunk's fellow sworn sword, Sir Bennis of the Brown Shield, had found the dam, taken personal offence to it, and resolved the matter by going to find the peasants responsible and cutting one of them across the cheek. This was, as solutions go, the kind that creates several new problems in the process of failing to solve the original one. Lady Rohan would want justice for her man's wound. Eustace would want the dam removed. Both of them had reasons to want the other one to back down first, and neither of them had any particular intention of doing so. Dunk arrived into the middle of this like a large stone dropped into standing water, and the ripples went further than he expected. She was called the Red Widow for the hair, which was tully red and remarkable, and for the husbands, of whom there had been 4, all of them dead, The title implied something it perhaps did not intend. She had not killed them. They had died in the ordinary ways that men die: war, illness, age, misfortune. Each death had left her more isolated, more in command of Coldmoat by default, more the kind of woman who draws the attention of men who assume that a holding without a lord is a holding waiting to be taken. She had refused enough of those men to have made a reputation for refusal that some people called cold and others called sensible. She was sharp. That was the thing that struck Dunk when he rode to Coldmoat to speak with her. Not coldness. That was the surface people reached before they got close enough to see what was under it. Underneath was a mind that had been in practice for a long time and had learned to read men quickly, because reading them slowly was how you ended up with a fifth husband. She listened to what Dunk said, and she heard what he had not said. When she answered him, it was the answer to both things simultaneously. She would not remove the dam, and she wanted Sir Bennis, the man who had cut her peasant, handed over to her justice. That history carries personal weight beyond politics. Rohan had been in love with Eustace's youngest son, Adam Osgrey, who died at the Redgrass Field. When Rohan revealed that Eustace had backed Daemon Blackfyre, she was not simply exposing a traitor. She was reopening a loss she had carried for years. A man she loved, dead in a cause that should never have been fought, on behalf of a father who made the choice that sent him there. The water dispute was the visible edge of something much older and much more painful. Before Dunk could bring this back to Eustace, she told him something else. Eustace Osgrey had supported Daemon Blackfyre. During the first Blackfyre rebellion, the old man had raised his banner for the Black Dragon. He had sent his sons to fight on the wrong side. He had watched all three of them die for a cause that lost. The crown had stripped most of his lands afterward. What remained was what could not reasonably be taken without leaving a man with nothing at all. Sir Dunk rode back to Standfast and began packing. This is the detail that matters most about him at this moment in his life. It is easy to slide past it. He did not argue with himself. He did not find reasons why the betrayal was understandable, or distant enough in time that it no longer applied. He simply concluded that the man he had sworn to was not the man he had believed he was swearing to, and that swearing to a false version of someone was not an honest and binding arrangement. He had no great speech about it. He packed his things. What stopped him from leaving cleanly was the fire. That night, Eustace's woods burned. The finger of suspicion pointed at Rohan. She had threatened fire and sword, and a fire had followed. Dunk found himself pulled back in before he could get free of it. He had disbanded Eustace's levies. He had told the old man he was leaving. But a woman he was not certain was guilty was being accused of an act he could not simply ride away from, and the thing was moving now, whether he was part of it or not. He rode to meet Rohan's forces at the river between the two holdings. Not for Eustace exactly, for the thing that was happening regardless of who he was sworn to, which was a situation that could resolve into unnecessary deaths unless someone tried to stop it. At the water, before her assembled men, he drew his dagger and cut his own cheek. He told Rohan that he was the one who had struck her man, taking the debt onto himself, away from Bennis, away from Eustace. He offered his own blood as the settlement of the debt before the fighting could start. It did not resolve everything. Rohan still wanted vindication for the fire, which he denied setting. Eustace still wanted the dam removed. Neither of them was willing to simply stand down. The dispute narrowed to the only ground that was genuinely neutral: the stream itself, the ford where neither lord's sovereignty was clear. It resolved the way disputes in Westeros so often resolved when all other options had been exhausted. Trial by combat. Rohan's champion was Sir Lucas Inchfield, called the Long Inch. He was tall, nearly as tall as Dunk, which was not common. He had been Coldmoat's castellan for long enough that he fought with the confidence of a man who had been the best option in the room for most of his adult life. They fought in the stream itself, thigh-deep in moving water, which removed most of the footwork. It was a contest of strength and endurance and the willingness to absorb what the other man was doing without going under. Sir Duncan won. He was badly injured doing it. Inchfield was not a man who went down without making you pay. Egg pulled him out of the water afterward and stood watch over him while he recovered. What followed was not a victory in any clean sense. Eustace and Rohan settled, and then the two old enemies who had been trying to ruin each other over a trickle of water got married. Rohan had loved Eustace's son Adam, had been in love with him before the Redgrass field took him. Adam had died because his father chose the Black Dragon. Rohan had carried that loss and the anger of it for years. Some part of what she had aimed at Eustace's stream was aimed at that old unhealed wound. They married, and the wound did not close exactly. But the two people carrying the opposite ends of it stopped pulling against each other. This is the lesson Standfast teaches, and it is a smaller and more honest lesson than the one Ashford taught. Ashford was about principle meeting power, and what that collision costs. Standfast is about something quieter, the texture of obligation in the parts of the world that no song ever reaches. Dunk had taken service with a man who turned out to be a traitor. He had tried to leave when he found out. The world had not let him leave cleanly, because the world rarely does. And so he had stayed and fought. He did not fight for the man exactly, but for the situation the man was inside, and the people caught in it alongside him. They left Standfast when the wedding was over, and the road was waiting. The invitation arrived in 212 years after Aegon's conquest, 3 years after Ashford. Lord Ambrose Butterwell of Whitewalls was taking a second wife, a daughter of House Frey, young enough to make the union slightly uncomfortable to look at directly. It was the kind of marriage arrangement that men of Lord Butterwell's age and ambition made when they needed heirs. To celebrate it, he was hosting a tournament. The prize for the winner of the joust was something unusual, a dragon egg, pale as cream, which Butterwell had kept in his family's possession for years, without anyone entirely understanding how it had come to be there. Sir Duncan and Egg were riding north toward Winterfell when they encountered the wedding party on the road. Through the particular logic of tournaments and proximity, they found themselves diverted toward Whitewalls instead. The first thing Egg noticed, as the guests assembled, was who was there. He had grown up surrounded by the names of the great houses, which meant he also knew which names tended to appear together and what their appearing together meant. The families gathering at Whitewalls for Lord Butterwell's wedding were a specific collection, not random, not the ordinary mix of lords and knights that a tournament in the Riverlands would normally draw. They were men whose fathers and grandfathers had, in notable proportions, raised their banners for Daemon Blackfyre 15 years earlier. Men who had bent the knee after the Redgrass field and paid their fines and surrendered their hostages and been permitted to keep their lands, who had been living since then in the particular quiet of people who have not changed their minds but have changed their behavior. Egg told Dunk what he was seeing. Dunk looked around the great hall of white walls, at the wine and the music and the wedding guests in their finery. He began to feel the specific unease of a man who has walked into a room that is not quite what it is presenting itself as. Then the fiddler found him. His name, or the name he was using, was Sir John. John the Fiddler, the knights around the tournament were calling him, for the instrument he carried and the ease with which he played it. He was young, lean, dark-haired, handsome in the way that draws attention without announcing itself. He had a quality that rooms responded to without knowing exactly why. Not the formal authority of a great lord, but something more personal and more difficult to resist. The kind of presence that makes people want to be nearby without quite being able to say what they are hoping to receive from the proximity. He pulled Dunk aside and told him about a dream. He had dreamed, he said, of Duncan wearing white. Head to heel in white, a long, pale cloak flowing from his shoulders. A white sword, a sworn brother of the King's Guard, the greatest knight in the 7 kingdoms, living for no purpose but to guard and serve his king. He said his dreams had a history of being accurate. His brothers, he said this carefully without naming them, had died the way he had dreamed they would die. He had not wanted to be right about that. He had warned them. They had not believed him. He was telling Dunk this, he made clear, because a man who was going to be a great knight should consider carefully which king he intended to serve. A choice was approaching, he implied, the kind that only arrived once and required the right answer. Meanwhile, something else was unraveling at the edges of the tournament. Sir Glendon Ball, a young knight who claimed descent from Fireball, one of the great champions of the first Blackfyre rebellion. He was accused of stealing the dragon egg. The accusation came suddenly, delivered loudly, with the quality of a story prepared in advance. Glendon was taken and placed in a cell beneath the castle. Above him, the tournament continued. Dunk watched this with a sense of looming doubt. He knew something about men accused of things they had not done. And he knew something about Glendon Ball that made the accusation feel wrong at a level below argument. Glendon had refused a bribe. During the tournament, someone had approached him and offered him money to throw his joust, to lose deliberately, to make way for another man's victory. Glendon had refused. That refusal, in a tournament where other knights were apparently not refusing similar offers, was the thing that had made him a problem. Not the egg, the principle. He would not be bought, and in a room organized around the premise that everyone had a price, that made him dangerous. Dunk recognized this. He was an unknown man from a house of no importance, in a room full of men with a long and renowned lineage. He had lived inside that dynamic. He understood it from the bone outward. He began to look at the fiddler differently. The tournament was rigged. Lord Peake was a man Dunk had taken a dislike to from the first moment, and it became apparent that he was engineering the outcome. The fiddler was supposed to win. The dragon egg was supposed to pass to him. The hatching of it was supposed to be the moment that turned a wedding celebration into something else entirely. Because the fiddler was not Sir John from anywhere. He was Daemon Blackfyre, the second of that name, third son of the first Daemon. He had dreamed in Essos about a dragon hatching at White Walls, and had allowed Lord Peake to convince him that the dream meant he should cross the narrow sea and reach for the throne his father had died trying to take. He had black-dyed hair hiding the silver gold beneath it. He had purple eyes he had not managed to disguise. Egg's eyes, Dunk thought, when the recognition finally assembled itself. because Egg and Daemon were both of Targaryen blood, and the blood expressed itself in the same way in both of them. Dunk went to the great hall and said it out loud. He named the fiddler as Daemon Blackfyre's son. He accused Lord Peake of stealing the dragon egg and planting it in Glendon Ball's saddlebags to clear Daemon's path to winning the tournament. He said these things publicly in a room full of people who had gathered specifically because they were prepared to support what Daemon intended. At Ashford, he had been frightened of dying. At White Walls, he was frightened of something colder, of the scheme succeeding, and what that would mean for the realm beyond the castle walls. Daemon, to his credit, was not the kind of man who resolved confusion by killing the person who created it. He ordered a trial, a joust, Glendon Ball against him, to resolve the question of the egg by the old logic of combat. Glendon unhorsed him on the first pass. The Brown Dragon, men would later call him. Daemon the Younger, riding out against a bastard-born knight with a borrowed horse and a name he was only half sure was his own, and going down in the mud in front of everyone he had come to impress. While this was concluding, Egg had found Lord Butterwell and backed him into a corner by the simple method of revealing his name and watching Butterwell's legs threaten to stop working. Dunk killed Tomard Heddle, Butterwell's son-in-law, who had decided that Egg was more valuable dead than alive. He sent Egg riding for Maidenpool and turned back to buy him the time to get clear. He did not need as much time as he thought he would, because outside White Walls, an army had arrived. Lord Brynden Rivers had known. This was the quality that defined Blood Raven above everything else. He had known about White Walls before Dunk arrived there, had tracked the pieces of the plot as they moved across the board. He had arrived with 300 raven's teeth and several thousand spears at exactly the moment when arriving with that many men resolved the situation without requiring anyone to fight particularly hard. Daemon walked out of the castle alone to meet him and was arrested without ceremony. Gorman Peake was beheaded for treason. Butterwell was permitted to keep his life and a tenth of his fortune. He was required to watch his castle, White Walls, the monument to his ambitions, pulled down stone by stone. Bloodraven came to Dunk afterward, in his tent, with the manner of a man who holds most of the information in any room and dispenses it in the portions he considers appropriate. Egg was there, sitting straight-backed in the way he sat when he was deciding not to be intimidated. Bloodraven let it be known sideways, in implication, without saying anything that committed him directly, that the dragon egg had been removed by his agents among the performing dwarfs who had attended the wedding. He had known about that too. Of course he had. White Walls ended without the battle it had been building toward. The rebellion never properly breathed. It collapsed under the weight of a plan that had never had quite enough support, a pretender who had never quite believed in himself, and a realm that had more resistance to being undone than the men who wanted to undo it had predicted. That resistance lived in its quiet instruments, in its hedge knights and its bald princes and its pale-eyed spy masters. 3 people had stopped it, operating at 3 entirely different levels and with 3 entirely different kinds of authority. None of them were celebrated for what they did that week. None of them had done it for the celebration. After White Walls, the record thins. This is the nature of a hedge knight's life, and it does not change simply because one of the 2 people living it is a prince in disguise. The great events get written down, the years between them, the roads and the weather and the work and the slow passage of one season into the next, largely do not. What survives of Duncan Egg's years after White Walls is a series of destinations and a handful of documented encounters, with the connective tissue mostly gone. They went north, as they had intended before the would-be rebellion interrupted them. Winterfell. They took service with Lord Beren Stark for a time, standing against the Ironborn raids that were troubling the northern coast in those years. They went elsewhere after that, the disputed lands, across the narrow sea, other places, other lords, other small campaigns that mattered enormously to the people caught inside them and were forgotten by everyone else within a generation. 20 years, roughly. From a boy of 9 in a tournament camp under an elm tree to a young man who had seen most of the realm from its working underside. Meanwhile, the realm was shedding its royal line at a rate that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. To understand how Egg became king, you have to trace 2 separate threads of the family. The succession ran through both of them before it found him, and the record tends to tangle them if you are not deliberate about keeping them apart. Daeron II had 4 sons. Baelor was the eldest, and Baelor died at Ashford. That is the thread Dunk carries. That death pushed the succession to the second son, Aerys I. He was a king of scholarly temperament who reigned for years without producing children, watching his heirs die around him while he sat with his books. Baelor's sons, Valar and Mataris, who would have stood between Aerys and the rest of the family, were taken by the Great Spring sickness within months of each other, before Aerys himself died. That branch was extinguished. The succession then passed to the third son, Rhaegal, who died. His twins Aela and Elora inherited what remained of the claim. Aela died in an accident at his twin sister's hand. Elora could not survive the weight of that and took her own life. Rhaegal's branch was simply gone, which left Maekar, the youngest of Daeron II's 4 sons, the hard man from Summerhall, who had spent years living with the knowledge that a blow he had not meant to land had killed the best of his brothers. He became king in 221 years after Aegon's conquest, 12 years after Ashford. His reign was not without its own erosions. His eldest son Daeron, the dreamer, the drinker, the young man who had told Dunk about a dragon falling on him at Ashford, had been right in the way his visions were always right. He outlived the tournament, but not his father's reign. The prophetic dreams that had been his inheritance and his torment drove him toward the wine, and the wine drove him toward the brothels. The brothels gave him a pox that worked through him slowly and killed him before Maekar did. He left behind a daughter, Viella, who was considered unfit to rule. The branch through him closed. His second son, Aerion, had been exiled to the Free Cities after Ashford. He returned eventually, married eventually, and in 232 years after Aegon's conquest, resolved the central confusion of his life in the most direct way available to him. He had always believed himself to be a dragon in human form. He drank wildfire. It did not complete the transformation he was certain was already half done. What it did was end a life that had been heading toward a bad conclusion since the afternoon at Ashford, when he broke a puppeteer's fingers one by one, which left Aemon, the third son, the capable one, the one who had always been the easiest of Maekar's sons to admire. Maekar had pushed him into the citadel to become a maester years earlier. Aemon had accepted this. By the time his father died, he was fully a maester, bound by vows of his own that sat in direct conflict with accepting a crown. He refused it. He told the great council that assembled to choose the next king that the choice was clear, that his younger brother was the right answer. He himself was going to the wall to ensure no one could use him as an alternative. And so, the Great Council looked at Aegon, fourth son of Maekar, who was himself the fourth son of Daeron II. The mathematics of this improbability were not lost on anyone in the room. The lords who had gathered to choose a king found themselves looking at a young man who had spent the years between Ashford and this moment travelling Westeros with a hedge knight, sleeping rough, taking service where service was available, learning the realm from its roads rather than its towers. Some of them called him half a peasant. They said it as a criticism. What they were accurately observing was that he had lived a life most kings never lived. He had sat in the inns and walked the roads and watched the small folk navigate a world organized entirely for the convenience of people who never had to think about them. The conclusion they drew from it was wrong. He was crowned Aegon V. The unlikely, the realm named him, and the name was not entirely unkind. It acknowledged something true, that this was a man who had arrived at the throne by a route no one had planned and no one would have predicted. Dunk was still on the road when it happened, still a hedge knight, still the same large, quiet man he had been for 20 years, with a sword and a horse and the accumulated knowledge of everywhere those two things had taken him. Egg had been his squire when they started. He was now a king. The road between those two facts ran through everything this account has been tracing. Ashford, Standfast, White Walls, the years in between. It ran through 100 small decisions made without any awareness that they were shaping a king, by a man who had no idea he was shaping one. When Aegon V sent for Dunk after the coronation, he was not sending for a celebrated hero or a man of great political utility. He was sending for the only person in the realm who had known him before he was anything, whose regard for him had never been calculated against what he might become, and whose honesty could be relied on. Every king needs someone like that. Most of them never have one. Egg had one. He had had one since an elm tree at Ashford Meadow, and a falling star overhead, and a bald boy who said it was lucky. The fiddler's dream, it turned out, was coming due. White armour, a long, pale cloak, the Kingsguard. The road was ending. Something else was about to begin. The Kingsguard vow strips everything away. That is the design of it, and the design is deliberate. A man who swears to the Kingsguard surrenders his family name, his inheritance, his right to hold lands or take a wife or father children, who will carry something of him forward into the world. He becomes, in the formal language of the oath, a white sword, a sworn brother, a man who exists for a single purpose and has renounced every competing claim on his time and loyalty. The white cloak is not a decoration. It is a declaration that the person wearing it has, in the most literal sense available, given everything else up. For a man born into a great house, this renunciation has genuine weight. There are lands to surrender, titles to relinquish, family expectations to disappoint. For Dunk, the accounting was different. He had no family name to relinquish, no name at all beyond the one he had made by travelling the realm for 20 years. He had no lands, no lordship, no children waiting in some keep for their father to come home. He had the horse he was riding and the armour on his back and the long accumulation of choices that had, improbably, brought him to this. What he surrendered was himself, the knight who had become who he was through the freedom of owing nothing to anyone except what his conscience dictated. The man who had kept his oaths because he chose to, without the structure of a permanent sworn lord to hold him to them. The hedge knight's particular and costly freedom was what the white cloak replaced. A white book sits in the tower of the hand, a great leather-bound volume in which every member of the Kingsguard since the founding has had their deeds recorded. The entries vary considerably in length. Some knights fill a paragraph, some fill a page. The book is not given to exaggeration. It is a record, kept by men whose job is precision rather than flattery. Generations later, a young king named Joffrey will page through that book in the White Sword Tower and stop at Dunk's entry with something that looks like confusion and feels like envy. He will ask why this one is so much longer than most. Jaime Lannister, sitting nearby with his own entry fresh and insufficient in his mind, will confirm simply that everyone says Sir Duncan was a great man. That will be the whole of his answer. It will be enough. The 4 pages cover a span of years and a variety of situations. The through line of all of them is the same quality that appears in every account of Dunk's life from the beginning. A man who saw what needed doing and did it, without stopping to calculate whether the doing of it served his interests. In 236 years after Aegon's conquest, 3 years into Aegon V's reign, Daemon Blackfyre III crossed the narrow sea with the Golden Company at his back. He raised the standard of the Black Dragon for the 4th time, the 4th generation of pretenders, the 4th attempt to finish what Daemon I had started on the Redgrass field, where Arlan's nephew Roger had died. Arlan himself had watched Lord Hayford fall beside him and had carried the grief of it until he found a large boy in Flea Bottom worth spending it on. Dunk rode out with the king's forces to Massey's Hook, where the Golden Company made landfall. He is credited with slaying Daemon Blackfyre III in the fighting that followed. The record attributes the kill to him with the same flat precision it uses for everything else. The Blackfyre cause died there, in the 4th generation, in one engagement on a coastal headland. What remained of the line, if anything did, would never raise a standard again. The next task for Dunk was a stranger and more personal. Prince Duncan Targaryen, Egg's son, the Crown Prince, had broken his betrothal to the daughter of Lord Lionel Baratheon and married a commoner instead. Lord Lionel, who had attended his daughter's humiliation from close range, renounced his fealty and declared himself the Storm King. He was reviving a title that had not existed since Aegon the Conqueror had burned its last holder out of the Stormlands. The rebellion was more gesture than strategy, but it needed settling. Aegon offered Lionel trial by combat, the king's champion against Lionel himself. The king's champion was Dunk. He fought a man he had reasons to respect, because the realm's order required it, and the king had asked him. The fight was hard. Lionel Baratheon was everything his reputation said, strong and skilled and angry in a way that sharpened rather than blinded him. Sir Duncan won. Lionel bent the knee. The rebellion dissolved, and Egg sealed the peace with a betrothal, his daughter to Lionel's heir, that turned the wound into an alliance. There were other deeds, quieter ones, and one that was not quiet at all. Aegon V sent Dunk to Eastwatch by the Sea with a specific charge: escort Maester Aemon to the Wall. Aemon had refused the crown and committed himself to the Night's Watch, the final and most absolute way of removing himself from the succession. He was going north to join the Black Brothers, and he was not coming back. Egg was sending his oldest friend to put his most trusted brother on a ship, to a life from which there was no return. Sir Duncan made the journey. He delivered Aemon safely to the Wall and rode back south alone. What passed between the two of them on that road, the Lord Commander and the Maester, the one going to serve a king and the one going to serve the Wall, is not recorded. The other deed the White Book notes is brief and entirely Dunk, a daughter of Lord Daemon Lannister, her ship taken by Greyjoy raiders. He retrieved her. No elaboration, no ceremony around it. The entry is 3 lines. By 252 years after Aegon's conquest, he was Lord Commander, the highest seat in the Kingsguard, the man whose judgment governed the protection of the king. That winter, a tourney was held in King's Landing. A mystery knight entered the lists and performed with an excellence that drew attention from the first pass. He unhorsed men of established reputation with a precision that looked, to experienced eyes, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it since they were old enough to hold a lance. Dunk rode against this knight and went down. The mystery knight was 16 years old. His name was Barristan of Harvest Hall, and he would be considered the finest pure knight of the generation that followed. Dunk was not diminished by it. He had never claimed to be the finest fighter alive. He had not become Lord Commander through the illusion that no one could unhorse him. What he felt was something closer to recognition than defeat. The tradition was passing forward. The standard he had spent his life carrying would not die with him. Summerhall appears in the histories in fragments, circled rather than entered directly, described in pieces that do not quite fit together. What survives contradicts itself in the small details, and agrees only on the large ones. It is as though the people who were there and survived carried the memory in ways that made full accounting impossible or inadvisable. What emerges is less a clear account than a shape, the outline of a night that consumed several lives and left the survivors unable or unwilling to fill it in completely. What drove Aegon V to Summerhall in 259 years after Aegon's conquest requires its own understanding, because it was not madness, whatever the simpler tellings suggest. Madness is easy. It explains without requiring you to understand. What drove Aeg was something harder and more recognizable. A man who had spent 26 years on a throne watching the thing he most wanted to accomplish remained just beyond reach. He had concluded, with the particular desperation of someone who has tried everything else, that the only remaining instrument was fire. He had been trying to change the realm since the day they crowned him. The reforms he had come to the throne carrying ran headfirst into the great lords, the way water runs into stone. Not dramatically, not in open rebellion, but through the quiet resistance of men who controlled the roads and the courts and the grain stores through which the crown's intentions had to pass before they reached anyone. They did not need to refuse. They needed only to slow. Aeg did not have the power of his ancestors. Dragons were long gone from this realm, and whether through madness, desperation, or something else entirely, King Aegon V looked to change that. With the power of dragons, Aeg would be able to truly build the realm he dreamt of. With dragons at his back, there could be no more time wasting, no more excuses from the lords and administrators of the realm. Dragons were power, but that power was no longer the Targaryens to hold. Summerhall was the palace where Maker had lived and where Aeg had grown up, before Dunk took him on the road. More comfortable than Dragonstone, more private than King's Landing. It was the place the Targaryens used when they wanted to be a family rather than a dynasty. It burned on a night in 259 years after Aegon's conquest. The exact sequence of what happened inside is one of the silences of history. What survives is partial and oblique, shaped by whatever the survivors understood and whatever they chose to say. Something had gone wrong with whatever Aegon was attempting. Something had gotten loose. What is certain is who died. Aegon V died at Summerhall. The king who had come to the throne as the unlikely, who had spent 26 years trying to make the realm better for the people at its bottom and been blocked at every turn by the people at its top, died in the palace where he had grown up. He died in a fire of his own making, before the answer to whether any of it would have worked could be given. His son, Prince Duncan, died with him, and Sir Duncan the Tall, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, died there. What the scattered fragments suggest about his death is this: he did not die still. He was seen in the fire carrying people out. The accounts are fragmentary and not fully consistent, but the shape that emerges from most of them is the same. A large man moving through the smoke and the heat, going in when the logic of survival said to go out, coming out with people and going back in again. Some accounts suggest a door forced open, someone pulled clear who would not otherwise have gotten free. Some suggest he went back in a final time and did not come out again. Outside Summerhall, on that same night, a child was born. His name would be Rhaegar Targaryen, the prince who would grow up haunted by a sense of destiny he could never outrun, who would set off the sequence of events that ended the Targaryen dynasty entirely. He was born while the walls of Summerhall were still burning. The story told afterward was that the sound of the fire was the first sound he heard. What survives in the White Sword Tower is the great leather book and its 4 pages. The book does not record what any of it felt like. What it holds is the outline, the shape of a life measured in its public acts, stripped of the interior weather that gave them their meaning. The moments in which a man decided, without ceremony and without audience, to be what he had said he was, those are not in the book. They were its entire foundation. Sir Duncan the Tall was not the finest fighter of his age. He was better with an axe or a mace than a lance, which is not how a celebrated knight is supposed to rank his instruments. He lost jousts. He struggled against men who had received better training from a younger age, who had grown up in castle yards rather than alleys. When Barristan Selmy unhorsed him at the winter tourney in King's Landing, Selmy was 16 and Dunk was somewhere past 50, and the result was not a close thing. The boy was simply better at that specific task than the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard had ever been. Not a strategist, not an orator, not born to anything. He arrived in the histories from nowhere, without luggage. So what were the 4 pages for? Dunk was, for 50 years, and against a varied and persistent set of reasons to stop, the most consistently honest knight in whatever room he occupied. Not the bravest. Bravery, as the willingness to face danger, was common enough among men who carried swords. What he carried was rarer. The willingness to pay the cost of the oaths on days when the cost was not obvious in advance, on days when it did not serve his interests, when no one who mattered was watching, and he could have looked away without consequence. At Ashford, dozens of knights saw Aerion break an innocent woman's fingers and chose not to act. Practical men, reasonable calculations. Dunk reached a different answer because the oaths were the structure he was built on. He kept the oaths because without them there was nothing underneath. That is not heroism, it is architecture. And the architecture made Egg. Aegon V carried the road onto the throne. The years of invisible travel turned away from inns, watching the small folk absorb the consequences of decisions made entirely without them, became the engine of his reign. The reforms he tried to make, the stubborn and mostly blocked attempts to extend something like protection to the people at the bottom of the realm, grew from memory rather than policy. a bald boy at an inn, and the way the world looked when it did not know your name. The succession produced a man who happened to be available. Dunk produced the particular kind of man he was. One image remains, and it is the right one to end on. Not Summerhall, not the White Sword Tower. A road, running through the reach in the dry season, or along the coast where the salt comes in off the water, or cutting between two hills toward a town neither of the people riding toward it has visited before. Dust rising behind two horses in the afternoon heat. A large man in the saddle with the slight awkwardness of someone who came to riding later than he should have. A bald boy on the smaller horse, too sharp for his age and too certain of it, looking at the horizon as though it might give up its information slightly ahead of schedule. Neither of them is important yet. The sky goes dark. Somewhere overhead, a star moves, a brief clean line of light drawn across the dark and then gone. The boy points at it, says it is lucky, and they ride into the morning. One more thread remains. A girl named Brienne, growing up in her father's castle on the island of Tarth, found a long-forgotten shield in her family's armory, battered and weathered, clearly belonging to someone else's history. On its face was a device she did not recognize, an elm tree with a shooting star above it, on a field the color of a sunset that had long since faded but was still visible if you looked. She had no idea whose it was. No one in the castle could tell her. She remembered it, though. Years later, travelling anonymously through the riverlands, she had her own shield repainted with the same arms, the same elm tree, and the same shooting star. She could not have said exactly why. Something about the old shield had stayed with her since childhood. It connected with her on a deeper level she could not quite understand. She never knew whose arms they were. It is known, though the path is obscured by time, that Brienne of Tarth carries the blood of Sir Duncan the Tall. The line itself is lost to record. No chronicle names the son or daughter through whom it passed. No maester sets down the branch by which it reached Tarth. Somewhere between the hedge knight who rose from Flea Bottom and the lady who walks the halls of Evenfall, the history thins and then disappears. What remains is not written, but evident. It is there in the shield kept at Evenfall Hall, in the height that sets her apart in any company, and more than that, in the same unyielding instinct that defined him, the quiet, stubborn refusal to be anything other than what a knight ought to be, even when the world around them treats that ideal as impractical or foolish, or both. Brienne became Lord Commander of the King's Guard, the first woman ever to hold that seat, the same seat, 3 centuries removed, arriving from the opposite direction, not from Flea Bottom, but from a lord's castle, not mocked for being too large, but for being the wrong kind of large, not uncertain about her oaths, but uncertain whether anyone would ever allow her to take them. She completed Jaime Lannister's entry in the White Book. She sat in the White Sword Tower with a quill and wrote down the deeds of a man she had loved. She wrote in the book that also held 4 pages for the man whose blood she carried and whose arm she bore and whose name she never knew. She was a true knight, so was he.